I think if you think about the opportunities in solar and distributed energy systems and solar prosumers, take a good look at your energy bill and think of what it's done over the last 5 years and think about what's happening with geopolitical events, with data centers, and who else knows what's next. Where do you think it'll be in the next few years, in the next 5 years? And if it's another, I don't know, 40%, that's what has gone up in the last 5 years in general, what would another 40% look like? And I don't know, what would you rather have compared to that type of situation? And then I guess I would say talk to others that have made changes recently in terms of solar, batteries, microgrids, things like that, because I think will be more and more interesting to look at those solutions.
Welcome back to Renewable Rides. Our guest today has done something remarkable. He traced the most extraordinary cost decline of nearly any technology. Greg Nemet is a professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison's La Follette School of Public Affairs, where he holds the Salzwedel Distinguished Faculty Chair in Business and Regulation. He is the author of How Solar Energy Became Cheap, now in its second edition, which examines how solar photovoltaic costs fell by a factor of more than 10,000, and what that means for how we power the world going forward. Greg is also a coordinating lead author for the IPCC's 7th Assessment Report, and a lead author on the landmark State of Carbon Dioxide Removal Report. If you want to understand why solar is now the cheapest source of electricity in history, how batteries are following a similar yet faster trajectory, and what it means for your business today, listen in to our conversation with Greg. All right, Greg, great to have you. As we do with all of our guests, we want to get to know you a little bit better, and so we'll typically start off with what are you passionate about, either personally or professionally or both?
Yeah, well, I spend a lot of time outdoors, often in the mountains. I'm at the University of Wisconsin now, so a lot of that means playing pond hockey in the winter. And I think I find myself very highly motivated to be working on protecting the environment and with doing things that enhance human well-being and human flourishing. And I like to work with others who have similar motivation. So that's led me to be working on clean energy for quite a while. And I feel like it attracts a lot of really interesting people. And I enjoy doing that a lot.
Yeah. And where do you think that came from? Was that a particular moment in life or just your upbringing?
Yeah, I mean, I could pinpoint it. You know, I took courses in undergrad. I was a geography major. I don't know if people know you can actually major in that, but I did. But I took a course on energy in that undergrad program, and another course on meteorology that led me to work on climate change. After undergrad, I worked in business and worked in Silicon Valley, did consulting, a startup, a think tank. And part of what I did in that era, it was kind of the internet 1.0, the dot-com days. I kind of came across, there was so much enthusiasm and interest and talent and money going into e-commerce at the time. And I just remember thinking like, well, why don't we have that much effort going into working on energy problems, which I knew from undergrad were important. And so I decided to do a PhD at UC Berkeley to work on that. And in a way, I'm still working on that problem is how can we create incentives to stimulate innovation in clean technology? And I'm still working on that now. So that's a direction my kind of personal interest in the environment took and transferred to an occupation and a work mission.
Really interesting, Greg. And I think Gareth and I both share a lot of that and why we do what we do as well. And both from a personal level, but also surrounding ourselves with really interesting people that care about the environment, love being outdoors. And so that really resonates. Maybe let's take a second before we dig into some of the more detailed things and just walk us through your career path. Like, how did you get here today? And you mentioned, working in a variety of places, but maybe spend a little time there.
Yeah. I mean, I think having some, I did management consulting after undergrad and just it seemed like an interesting thing to do. And I had some friends at the place I was working. And, some of the tools I learned from working in that environment have been useful in academia, which you wouldn't really think that those are similar environments. But, I spent a lot of time working at large companies. It was in the pharmaceutical industry and just understanding how behavior works and how changes can happen in large organizations, I think was interesting. understanding how planning works. I thought that was really interesting, like looking at new chemical entities and kind of working out how you could predict whether they would come to market, and if they did, how big they would be. And then when you put a whole portfolio of those chemicals together, how you can kind of end up with a pipeline and a revenue stream looking far out. And I found that interesting. And it's been really applicable to looking at clean energy and thinking about new ideas that might go somewhere and might not. And I think to me, it makes me less discouraged about things that are long shots, because if you put a lot of long shots together, you can get a blockbuster drug like a statin or something. And similarly, you can get like a fuel cell or a lithium ion battery or a LED light bulb or something that just really changes things and has far reaching impacts. And so it's been nice to be able to use some of that experience that I gained before I changed direction and working really on energy, and bring it to the energy problems, because there's a lot of dimensions to energy issues. And so learning from how businesses work and then later how policy worked has been all instrumental in being able to work with different types of people and reach different audiences. Yeah, I think that was coming at a time, I guess, I was working in Silicon Valley and just becoming more aware of energy issues. And at the time, I think someone I was speaking with was really interested in fuel cells, and that was potentially a really transformative technology. And I thought that was just interesting that you could have something that could really change things. And then another aspect, I guess, was I did a study I guess it was the early 2000s, about looking at R&D and innovation in different sectors like consumer products, healthcare sector, biotechnology. And then we just threw in energy as a comparison. And energy was lower on every metric, and often by an order of magnitude, like the number of scientists involved, the number of patents coming out, the R&D dollars going into it. And I just thought, like, wow, what a missed opportunity. Like, we've got things moving pretty fast on IT and on biotech. Couldn't we do something on energy? And so I wrote an application for grad school and just happened to connect with an advisor at UC Berkeley who had been working on that and working on why we don't have more energy R&D and advancing new technologies. And some of that has changed quite a bit. There's way more enthusiasm and people working on the problem now. And so it's been really encouraging to kind of watch that happen over the last couple decades.
Yeah, it's got a lot better, hasn't it? I think it's amazing seeing energy being mainstream media now, and that's getting all the maybe unusual suspects now excited about the industry. And we're even seeing it in terms of like the venture capital world. I think the challenge seems to be then just connecting that old muscle memory with dealing with like big infrastructure players here and getting people to understand the difference between SaaS software and actually implementing complex infrastructure projects.
Right. Yeah, some fundamental differences. But it's real. I mean, one thing I've been tracking is just looking at media mentions of the word energy. And every year I have a student update the graph. And for a long time, I was using that to make the point that we only care about energy when there's a crisis. So like in the 70s, we had big spikes of media coverage. But that's changed over the last 10 years. We have this steady increase in attention to it. So I think, yeah, what you're seeing is what I'm seeing in the data too, is that people are paying attention more and more. Now we do have a crisis, so it's a crisis on top of a trend. So that's a lot of opportunity.
Yeah, I imagine your graph this year might be blowing up.
Yeah, that'll be interesting to see. I'll have to extend the vertical axis on that one.
Yeah. So it's cool checking out your book, Greg. And, solar is obviously one of those transformational technologies that you were speaking to before. And you talked about costs falling from $100 a watt back in the 70s to 10 cents today or less, a factor of more than 10,000. That still actually blows my mind thinking about that. What surprises you about that outcome even today, kind of seeing the trajectory we're on?
Well, same as you. I mean, it's a miracle that it happened. It wasn't a miracle in terms of it being accidental, but just completely transformative. And, one way I put it, if you think about the first commercial solar cells, those were used by the Navy to put on a satellite to compete with Sputnik in the space race in the 1950s. If you took those cells and put them on your house to power your home, that would be about $300,000 per month for your electric bill. And now we're talking about something that's in the tens of dollars to power your electricity. So it just completely transformational. So that itself is just amazing. And when you start to look under how that's happened, I think one thing that's been surprising is that people got smitten with the technology. And as a result, you had people working on solar even when it wasn't a crisis, even when it wasn't in the spotlight. And I think that really allowed the technology to survive when, like in the 1980s, electric prices crashed. There wasn't attention on energy anymore. Alternative energy got in the back seat. And yet the technology still progressed for a variety of reasons. But I think that was an important aspect of it, the human aspect of people still wanting to work on it. I think also I was amazed at how global a story it was. I think that's what made me feel like I needed to write a full-length book and travel around the world and interview people all over the place, because it wasn't one that you could constrain to one country's decisions or policies or actions. So that was important. And then finally, it was surprising how long it took. And it's interesting to say both of those things. Like, one, it's been a dramatic cost reduction, and two, it feels like suddenly we're talking about solar potentially becoming the dominant energy technology, or the biggest one. But it also took kind of too long. Like, if we want to do what we did for solar with other things that might be helpful for us, we'd also want to speed it up, because solar took like 70 years from the first application to where we are today. So got to do things faster. So yeah, a lot of interesting surprises in that bigger story.
Well, back to your previous comment on the lack of R&D dollars and people, if you will. If I kind of put the two industries against each other, the computing industry versus, solar and the energy industry, do you think that that's the primary reason why it took 7 years? Because if you think about what we have at our fingertips today versus even 20 years ago, I mean, we're approaching the 20-year anniversary of the iPhone coming out, but even 40 years ago with personal computers and everything, do you think it was driven by the lack of R&D dollars or something else?
Well, I think the lack of R&D dollars were an issue, except in this crisis period in the 1970s. And one connection to computers was that in 1975, the person who was hired to lead the U.S. solar R&D program, that was this massive increase in funding for solar, came from the computer industry, came from Texas Instruments. And one of the things he brought with him was this idea of the learning curve, that as Texas Instruments built calculators, the costs were coming down, and they use that to forecast and do their marketing and even price their product to maybe forward price a bit, because you could see the costs coming down. And he made a chart in 1975 predicting how much solar we'd have to build to get the cost to be competitive with fossil fuels and when that would happen. And a couple of years ago, I just plotted where we are today, and he was right on. He was a little pessimistic. It's gone faster, or like cost reductions have happened faster than they did with calculators. And so that's been a big part of the story. But connections to computers have been important throughout. But maybe this, on your slow point, one of the issues is you don't have those immediate benefits that computers created. It was a new service that I guess could only have been done by armies of accountants or slide rules or things like that. So it was immediately beneficial. Whereas solar had to compete with a well-established electricity generation from fossil fuels. And so it was a different story of not providing something new, but just creating different attributes and finding niche markets along the way so that it could compete and fall in costs and eventually compete with fossil fuels like it does today.
Yeah. And you kind of speak to the fact that this wasn't just R&D in one location and manufacturing in one location. It was kind of happening real hotspots around the world. Yeah. Can you tell us how that innovation actually rolled out and how internationalized it actually was?
Yeah. I mean, the one thing I say is that no one country did it. It was more of a relay race, a passing of the baton, each country contributing distinct capabilities, something that it was good at, and other countries building on that. There was a lot of trade. If I put the whole story in one sentence, I would simplify it to say that the U.S. created the technology, Germany built a market, and China made it cheap. And there was a few other countries involved, but that was the basic sequence over this 70 years or so. And I mean, the global aspect of it was just tremendous. And one of the, one period, it really captures this. And this is in the mid 2000s, so like 2005. So you have U.S. teachers' pension funds invested in the stock market. Some of that is going into IPOs for Chinese solar companies. So in mid 2000s, China and green energy was awesome combination. So you have a Chinese solar company raises $300 million from teachers' pension funds, takes that money back to Wuxi, China, and starts purchasing equipment from all over the world, from Applied Materials in the US, from companies in Austria and Switzerland and Germany, brings that equipment back to Wuxi, starts making solar panels and sells them where there were markets. And the first place that there was a big market was Germany. And that lasted for a while. And then it was Spain. And then it was California. And then you had other markets. And eventually China becomes the biggest market. And it still is today. And so you have this just completely internationalized chain of ideas moving around, of people moving around, capital moving around, and products moving around. And that was kind of the magic. And we're in a different world today, but the benefits of that kind of moving around of ideas and knowledge embodied in machines and other, I think is an irresistible aspect of globalization that even in a world like today where there are more barriers created with tariffs, et cetera, the benefits of this kind of collaborative system are still great. And so that's why I see, despite this kind of slowdown in trade that we see kind of intentionally, some of this innovation stuff that comes out at the global level, I expect to continue just because you get to take advantage of distinct capabilities that happen from all over the world. And some of those are rooted in culture and education and national innovation systems. So that was a big part of the solar story.
We'll come back to some of the more recent policy pieces, but are you seeing a similar type of, you call it relay race, but this trajectory with batteries today?
It's a similar story with batteries. You had some early work, especially by the US and Japan, but it all seems to be a bit more accelerated. So it happens more quickly, and it happens to get dominated by China more quickly as well, at least for now. And I guess for both solar and batteries, I really think that there are going to be strong forces to distribute that manufacturing, of not have it be so concentrated in one place that both solar and batteries are today. And the know-how and the technology, just like it had a way of moving around the world and ending up in China, a lot of the know-how that China is developing is likely to move around the world and end up in other rapidly growing economies that need vehicles for mobility or power for lots of different things. And so I do think we'll have less concentration than we have today. But the battery story is quite similar to solar, both how it happened and where we've ended up.
And the kind of dispersion or trying to deconcentrate from China, is that largely driven by policy, or are there other forces at play?
Policy probably does play a role. I think what the force that's really driving it is this kind of idea of self-reliance, of independence and autarky, of wanting to be self-sufficient. For example, India is doing this in a big way, and they've gotten into manufacturing solar, and they're nowhere near the scale of China, even though their population is similar. But they are quite near being self-sufficient on solar panels and being able to fuel their own installations and the anticipated growth in the future. And so I think the India model is one we're likely to see. India doesn't want to be dependent on China, I guess, for anything, but especially not for something that fuels their energy program. And so being able to develop on their own, I think, has been an interesting one to watch. And I expect we'll see that in other places as well.
And Greg, you touched on this briefly before in terms of as we produce more of this tech, the price point comes down and the technology gets better. Dan and I just did a podcast episode recently looking at the cost of inaction. And a lot of the pushback we get from people thinking about this is, should I wait because the technology is always improving? But our assessment showed that the cost of waiting and the impacts of rising utility rates far outdid now some of the cost or innovation benefits. But
Yeah.
do you foresee any kind of big step changes in that, or is it now going to be, from a solar battery perspective, is it going to be incremental progress?
Incremental progress, that's what it's been, and I expect that will continue. But but still progress. And I think that's the important thing, that both solar and batteries are coming down in cost, and it is along this learning curve, as you say. And the battery one is even a bit faster than the solar one, and that's leading to really rapid adoption. And we're seeing adoption of electric vehicles faster than almost anything that, like, there's a database a student and I put together of like 200 technologies, and batteries are really close to the top. And so, yeah, that dynamic of building more and the costs come down has been really important. And that's an interesting analysis that you mentioned too about, are there benefits to waiting? And you might say that there are, but if your alternative is increasing in costs like electricity rates and natural gas is, then the benefits to waiting are probably small and maybe none.
Yeah, certainly, and something that comes into the calculus of the business case for these. But maybe like when you came out with your second edition of your book recently, you described the solar centric economy. What does that mean, and how should business leaders be making decisions around energy today and moving forward versus the environment that we were all living in just 5 years ago?
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's just something that snuck up on me when I had a publisher approach me and said, would you do a second edition of the book? And my first reaction is like, I'd like to do something different because I enjoy like learning new things. But as I looked into solar, I was like, oh, wow, things have like moved a lot since the first edition. Like the cost had come down by 75%. The adoption was going up really quickly. And then crucially, new countries were starting to adopt solar. And that I thought was really interesting. So as I looked into it and just looking at the growth, solar has been growing at 30% a year for almost 40 years. And as I was looking at the drivers of why solar has grown so fast, it looks likely to continue that way. Like none of those drivers are going away. And some of them seem to be getting new life, like the cost of fossil fuels, for example. And so you don't need to grow at 30% a year globally for too much longer until solar becomes the number one source of energy. And it looks like, it could be on the order of 10 to 15 years if we're at the current growth rates. If growth rates crash to half of what they've been for the last 30 or 40 years, then we still have solar become the biggest technology, but it takes 15 to 20 years. And so you'd have to be actually pretty pessimistic about a change from what it's been doing to end up in a place where solar is not the biggest. And so it feels like it's almost inevitable that it happens. I mean, things can get in the way, there's barriers, and so those are important to address. But just in looking at it from a very macro, simple way, it just keeps going. And so if it does keep going and solar is at the core of the energy system, rather than on the margins, you start to think about new uses of solar and new locations for solar and new ways to take advantage of it. And I think that to me has become the real interesting part about solar. It's not so much could we get solar manufacturing in our district and create a profitable business from it. Maybe there's possibilities to do that. It's more, can we take advantage of this different energy source that's clean, but it's also modular, and pair it with batteries and do something pretty clever. And so I think you're seeing a lot of creativity on that. And I think one endorsement of this being kind of an indication of the future, and also to show how cheap solar has gotten, a lot of the most innovative installations are happening in the global south, in developing economies where incomes are quite low, but grid reliability is also quite low. And so this combination of solar, batteries, and some IT lets you do a lot of interesting things. Like Pakistan is one that's emerged as like just massive solar producer and was really kind of sneakily eating away at the grid electricity because people were pulling panels from China and installing them, and all of a sudden you had much less demand, even as you're having increased air conditioning load. And so more of that to come, and you are seeing it in other places as well.
Yeah, the Pakistan story has been quite interesting to watch from the outside. Bridging your research and policy, one of the things that I feel like has been coming up more and more, particularly here in the States, is this question that business leaders, and I think many people in kind of that are inside the energy industry are having, is we've got the investment tax credits going away. based on the new policy. And is that just going to kill solar? I mean, I was just on a call with some business leaders of a very large commercial real estate asset owner, and they said, "Oh, well, we've got to get some projects done between now and the 4th of July because this is just going to kill all potential projects." What are you seeing in the data and kind of that cost curve versus the tax credit component?
Yeah, I guess the one thing, I mean, I always try to speak from what we've seen in the evidence and from some historical evidence. And so one thing you see when you have tax credits end quickly is you have a rush to take advantage of the tax credits with safe harbor or just getting things built by the deadline. And then you see a lull after because you've pulled some projects forward and then there's a little bit less incentive. But then it comes back after. And that's what we saw with wind power. In the early 2000s, we had these tax credits for wind that kept expiring every 18 months, and then they'd take another 6 months for Congress to reauthorize them. And so you'd have these periods where you had little built, but then it comes back. And I think solar is even likely to be less volatile than that because you've got this cost have come down so much, and also this current environment with, for a variety of reasons, the price of gas and the price of electricity from gas and others has this kind of indication of long-term rise. And so solar projects get more and more attractive. And the other thing is batteries too. So, I guess if you think about it one way, you've got maybe 20-25% of tax credit that's going away, but that's just, a couple, 2 or 3 years of cost reductions that are happening. And so I expect disruption, but it doesn't end things. And I think the continued fall in cost of solar and batteries, but batteries fueling solar, that's a new thing that really increases the value proposition of solar, as does the rise of fossil fuel and grid electricity. So it's a good chance that those drivers offset the one big beautiful bill effect.
We tend to agree, Greg, especially when you factor in the tax credits stick around for batteries and you've got 100% depreciation in year one. So there's still a lot of good commercial offerings. And I think something that really resonates with us is where you speak about actually the hardware is only 25% of these project costs today. It's becoming almost the nominal part of it. And the rest is all of this soft cost. And it's one of the reasons we actually started VECKTA was to compress that soft cost out of the system and make it way more efficient, way more simple, way more intuitive to go and invest. Based on your research, what are you seeing on that soft cost side? And do you want to just explain to the listeners what a soft cost is and why it makes up such a big portion of doing projects today?
Yeah, right. So one of what I've been mostly talking about is the cost of solar modules, like a solar panel. And those for a long time were the big cost because they were really expensive to produce. And as they've come down in cost, the rest of the system, so it's people on roofs, swinging hammers, connecting electrical, putting in the bracing if they're on the ground, setting up the stands and the systems for that, and then including things like marketing and customer acquisition as well. And over time, those costs have become the biggest component of costs. And so there has to be innovation on that for costs to come down as well. And there has been, and that's been something we've been tracking as well, is that we do see that this balance of system costs or these soft costs are also coming down, just not quite as quickly as the hardware costs. So as a result, most of the cost now is on the soft cost. One thing, so on one hand, things are improving on the soft cost side, they're coming down. But on the other hand is to look at other places, like Australia is the one that I look to in the book, and it's pretty dramatic how they have installed so much solar. I think it's about a third of the homes have solar on them now. And they have deals where you get a one-day installation. There's this automatic permitting and a lot of single-story homes. So that makes things easier and less expensive, and some less heterogeneity in the types of roofs that are around. But this is also a fossil fuel intensive economy, and they've gone big on solar with a good solar resource, but not more than the US. And so I think we can learn from other places that also have similar labor costs to here and also are importing a lot of their panels, but yet find ways to install them really effectively and with lower costs. And so I think that's been something that I've been trying to learn more about. And I think there's more to learn as well as to how did somewhere like Australia end up at a third of the cost of the US on the installs. I
know you spent time at the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, and we actually quote often I believe it was the microgrid phase 2 study that highlighted that large portion of these projects, and in that depending on the project size and everything, they said between 30 and 70% are these soft costs. And it's interesting that same group that was saying, oh, is the industry going to die, after the tax credits go away? I actually brought that up to them and showed them a graph of like you can make up a lot of the losses by the tax credits going away just by compressing soft costs. And you hit on marketing, customer acquisition, and just kind of EPC and developer margin by bringing some of that down, and rather than them eating up the tax credits or the value of the tax credits for the buyer, they're just having to bring some of their margins down, and that's going to make up for it, right? Along with the hardware costs coming down. Absolutely. And I had a PhD student, this was a while ago, studying how competitive solar installers are. And that was one of the observations he had, is that there's a lot of solar installers, but they tend not to compete with each other that much. And so I think exactly what you're saying, there is room for people to have sustainable businesses, but maybe have the margins be not like they are right now as well. I'd love to connect with that student, because that's a cornerstone of our business, is driving competition amongst the suppliers in the space. Yeah, right. Absolutely. For exactly that. That's awesome. Well, so what's the strongest business case you've seen for a commercial company to become an energy prosumer? And maybe it's worth us kind of defining for the listeners the consumer versus prosumer, but optimizing their interaction with the grid. Yeah. So historically, from the 1930s and I guess earlier, people that used electricity were consumers of electricity, and they're still thought of that by utilities and others. And they might be a residential consumer, but also a commercial or industrial consumer as well. And there's this notion that you could have, because of things like solar and being able to generate your own electricity, you could become a producer and a consumer. And so this idea of solar or energy prosumers has emerged. And one thing I've been working on in a different project with some colleagues is looking at these clusters of innovation. And if you look at the prosumer cluster, there's a lot of different innovations that come together here that are creating an opportunity. So there's the generation side, which you could say is mostly from solar, but could be on-site geothermal or small wind or something like that. But you could just focus on the solar part. There's something about storage, and that could be a dedicated battery system, but it easily could just be a vehicle or a fleet where you have some storage of electricity. And one big thing to observe is that there's a lot more storage in a vehicle than there is in the type of battery anyone would do in like a residential or probably even a commercial facility. And so being able to do bidirectional charging with vehicles starts to make it much easier to be a prosumer. And then the other ingredient is the digitalization and the IT part of it. So having systems that are interconnected, having information flowing around the system, energy management systems. That's a way to manage how you use energy and when you use energy. And so putting those things together, you start to have a stronger case for, wow, electric rates keep going up. And they're also volatile, at least for, say, gas prices, for example. Is there a way to make my energy system more predictable and maybe also lower the cost? And I think this constellation of producing your own energy with solar, storing it in a battery or a vehicle, and then having IT in the system to make it all work together is looking pretty attractive. And then you can even think of stronger versions where you have these systems linked together, potentially in a microgrid, and maybe beyond the regulatory system we have right now, but have some peer-to-peer energy trading. Because why not? We trade our rooms and we trade our vehicles on Airbnb and on Uber. And so why can't we trade electricity? And one of the reasons is electrical monopolies and the system that's been in place for 100 years. But
At some point, if you continue to have rising rates and these alternative technologies that look attractive, I think you start to see some defection from the system and start to have people being clever about how they find that it might even be better not to work on your own doing that, but link up with neighbors or adjacent businesses or something like that. And so I think our current moment could really kind of supercharge this kind of idea of the energy prosumer, because the deal you're getting from just being a consumer is looking like a worse and worse deal, not an attractive deal. And these alternatives start to get really interesting.
Yeah. And Greg, are you seeing the utilities starting to lean into this a bit more? Because obviously they're under a lot of stress right now, trying to deal with the data center load requests and more electrification. And they were kind of anti us generating our own energy in the past, but now it seems like they're kind of desperate for any capacity. Are you seeing that shift?
I mean, I've seen it in some small areas. Like, I think I've often looked at places like smaller ones, like Green Mountain Power, where they're subsidizing people to put batteries in their homes so they don't have to build new generation. And that was really started before the data center big push. And so I think some of those models are interesting and spread to other places. But there's also some conservatism in the system, sometimes for good reason, partly because they've got a pretty good deal with the monopoly regulation, and also because they're in charge of providing critical infrastructure where reliability is essential. And so they do have a really important job that has to do with public safety. And so there's reasons for them not to be as innovative as maybe the opportunities that exist would suggest. Yeah.
And I love you speaking to the vehicle battery component, because I don't think people realize that. I'm driving the Lightning, and that's like 150 kilowatt battery. And that's like 10x more than what most homes would ever consider. And that's a massive opportunity, isn't it? That we've got these mobile batteries on wheels that can dispatch a lot of power when they need to. Yeah.
And I think this, we now have options where there is bidirectional charging available, and like discharging the vehicle battery for home use, that starts to look really, really interesting. Yeah. But big batteries in vehicles compared to what you do in a basement.
And any thoughts on how we overcome that kind of policy challenge to prosumer energy in the future? Are you seeing any opportunities to really push back on the traditional model?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think what I would look for are kind of early adopters and leaders that show that it works. So if you start to see places like, and maybe it's small utilities that are just interested in avoiding the expense of some new generation, I think proving that it works will get these more risk-averse utilities that might be bigger and might just be more conservative to start to consider those and maybe start to do pilots. So in one sense, a gradual process of starting to adopt some of these behaviors can be helpful. But on the other hand, you mentioned data centers. That's putting a lot of pressure on rates, but also on generation and meeting peak demand. And that might accelerate things so that good ideas get adopted more quickly than they might otherwise. So I think that's what I would look for, is these kind of leaders to establish some viable models.
Yeah. And so, when you think about the residential market's become fairly mature now, I'd say utility scale projects have grown in capacity and volume. The commercial industrial space that we particularly focus on has always been a bit of a laggard. But everything you've described, technology costs down, soft costs dropping, more and more opportunity to shift from being a passive consumer to be a prosumer. What's your kind of honest take on the opportunity for business leaders to be really starting to think about energy in a different way?
I think that market, or that segment you discussed, is a real sweet spot, because one thing I've been looking at is kind of looking at the install costs at different scales. And the cheapest install cost is a massive desert facility, and the most expensive is a tall single family home. But the kind of commercial industrial scale looks closer to the large utility scale than it is to the single family home cost. And so I've always thought is a pretty sweet opportunity. And, I travel around and I see lots of roofs with not much on there except some HVAC equipment. And boy, what an opportunity those are, because they're really not using it for for anything else. And so I guess, it's the systems becoming more affordable, the appeal of these kind of prosumer sort of arrangements, and then the rising cost of utilities. That does start to make the business case look a lot better. But it's a nice size, I would say, in terms of the economics of it for the whole range of solar possibilities.
Yeah, and the other nice thing, or critical thing in the commercial industrial is that you're competing with retail rates, whereas the large utility scale projects are competing with wholesale rates, right?
Yeah,
so,
exactly.
Right?
Big difference.
Yeah, and I think they're going to get hit more with the ITC going away versus the commercial industrial. And like for business leaders too, it's been a shift in the last couple of years of really thinking of these systems as assets. I think historically it's been thought of as a sustainability measure. Now it's more of an economic play, and especially as you start to add batteries in, really becoming an asset as part of your broader real estate asset. We deal with a lot of real estate companies, whether they own and lease or whether they're owner occupiers. And now this whole idea of energy systems at your facility becoming valuable assets and increasing property value is coming into play. And I think you'll be able to monetize them more and more as some of these new programs come in. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good observation. One place I see that is I have colleagues I work with at Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, and they've done a lot of work on looking at the value of like a household with solar on it versus not. And they see there is a premium, but it's mostly attributable to what you talked about for the kind of a green premium. But that was from years ago. And now that it's a way to offset more and more expensive grid electricity, it starts to look as a real asset rather than just something that appeals to some people's sensibilities. And that changes things a bit. And I just don't see that changing. I think the data center revolution and the pressure on grids has created that for everybody, but there's other pressures as well. There's geopolitics that's happening right now too. And all the signs are in the same direction, is more pressure on electricity. And so having this generation and the cost of generation going down just looks more and more of a valuable asset rather than just a nice thing to have.
Love it. I think we're very aligned in how we're seeing and thinking about the market. So really appreciate you sharing. Before we jump into our power surge round, Greg, we'd love to just you've been critical to the IPCC 6th edition, and you're writing the 7th edition. That's obviously a massive undertaking. I'd love you to just share what does that process look like?
Yeah.
How long are you working on it? What were some of the standout outcomes from the 6th edition? And
right.
If there's anything you can share about kind of the process you're working through right now for the 7th, that'd be amazing.
Yeah, well, it's a process, that's for sure. And I would say I've been working in academia for a long time, and things move slowly here, but it's fast compared to something like an intergovernmental organization where you've got lots of people from around the world providing thousands of comments. So that's been a different way to work. But I think one thing I've found really productive about the IPCC process is that you end up with a consensus document that gets signed off on by like 200 countries around the world, and they've been redlining all the words in the executive summary. And that's a pretty intensive process, and it ends up being kind of a negotiation, but good arguments and facts and science do win the day on those, at least over a couple of weeks of that kind of negotiation process. And so that's been really encouraging. The other aspect I would say is that my experience is that, in IPCC, a lot of the historical motivation for climate scientists to be working on a big public report is to light a fire under policymakers and say, you're not understanding how bad the situation is and how bad it could be. We need to do something about it. And so there's been a lot of that mentality. And I think as I've been working on these issues, that is a motivation, but it's not the primary outcome that insight I'd take away from all that work. The primary one for me is that like a lot of these solutions are getting much better than they were before. So I end up with this mantra that I say now, that the climate problem is getting worse, but the solutions are getting better. And both of those things are true. And you have to hold that contradiction to understand where we're at in the problem. And so I do think, though, that aspect of the solutions getting better is getting more appreciated and becoming more of the discourse. And then for this 7th assessment report, which I guess started about a year ago and have a report coming out near the end of the decade, that I'm working on a chapter there, leading a chapter on enablers and barriers. And so it's all about what are the enablers that overcome barriers? And the focus there is on how has that happened? What's the empirical results that show that this is possible? And that to me is a great thing to be working on, because I think lots has been tried over the last 10 years especially, and we're trying to document it and show that barriers that you think of as problems and reasons why we can't do something have been overcome in certain places. So let's learn from that. And that's all about what we're trying to do with that chapter. So yeah, it's an exciting process. And it's like, yeah, good news, bad news is always the theme coming out of it.
Of all the aspects of that, I think I would be most interested in exactly what you're working on, the enablers and barriers. I think that's super fascinating, because it's really, it's about action, right? We need to identify what's going on, but then really it's about taking action.
Yeah.
And so I love that you're working on that. Well, let's shift gears and close out with our power surge round that we always go through with each guest. So I'll start things off with, if you could be any one energy technology, what would it be and why?
Well, that's fairly easy for me. I'd be a solar panel, and I'd be on a mountain hut. And I've seen a bunch of those, because I'm saying it with a clear vision in my head. I've done a lot of hiking in the Alps, and there's these huts they have throughout where you can stay overnight and get some food. And there's one that's the first net zero energy building on top of a mountain, and it's powered by solar. And that's one I could live there as a solar panel. So that'd be my answer.
That's so awesome. Have you ever heard of the GR5 route, Greg?
No, where's that?
I hiked it after university. It goes from Geneva to Nice all the way through the French Alps.
Wow.
And if you get a chance, it's like a 350-mile trip, but you get to stop every 3 to 5 days. But
perfect.
Beautiful terrain. So
that's great.
That's the spot.
Keep an eye out for that one.
Yeah. You obviously consume a lot of information. You're sharing a lot of information. Do you have any favorite resources?
I listen to podcasts. I find the energy transition podcast, I find super insightful. I learned so much from it. I admire a lot of the guests that are on that, and some that I don't know, I start to follow. So I really recommend that to people. A second thing in terms of reports, I think for understanding the energy transition, I really think that getting up-to-date information is really important. And I mentioned the IPCC, and that's like gold standard, peer-reviewed, solid, approved by all countries, but it can be out of date fairly quickly, and things change pretty quickly. And so I really have a lot of respect for organizations that can have comprehensive, reliable data quickly. And some of the reports by Ember on electricity systems, I rely on a lot, because I teach, I do this kind of public outreach, and I do research, and I just need to stay up to date. And that's one of the type of sources I find really useful.
We've found them useful as well. We in fact had Kingsmill Bond on the podcast.
Oh yeah, great.
Quite a while back. Yeah. They do some great work there.
Yeah.
All right. Well, let's close out with, in my life, I will have been successful when.
Well, I'm enjoying the journey. And I would say that working on climate is always a roller coaster, and that's been the case as long as I've been working on it. And I look at the data, and that it is up and down. It's more fun when the wind is at our backs and there's a lot of support for the actions that we're thinking about doing. But I think it's more important when climate's not top of mind, when other priorities have emerged. And I think this is one of those times. And so I find it really encouraging to see, you doing the work you do, having podcasts, getting the word out, me teaching students and seeing them still being interested in these issues, even when the policy environment is less supportive than it was. And so, I look ahead to the next opportunity we have when there's a lot of public consensus that we need to do something about this and that things move. But that's not the only time to be working on these problems. So, so enjoying the journey, but it's a roller coaster for sure.
Great. If you could leave one message in people's minds to close out, this discussion, what would it be?
I think if you think about the opportunities in solar and distributed energy systems and solar prosumers, just take a good look at your energy bill and think of what it's done over the last 5 years, and think about what's happening with geopolitical events, with data centers, and who else knows what's next. Where do you think it'll be in the next few years, in the next 5 years? And if it's another, 40%, that's what has gone up in the last 5 years in general, what would another 40% look like? And what would you rather have compared to that type of situation? And then I guess I would say talk to others that have made changes recently in terms of solar, batteries, microgrids, things like that, because I think will be more and more interesting to look at those solutions.
It's a great way to close out. Greg, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you for sharing your insights. Thank you for doing the work that you do, and bringing up the next generation that's going to join us, in this industry through your teaching as well. Great talking to you both. Thanks, Gareth. That was an awesome episode, and Greg is so knowledgeable, and really appreciate all the work he's doing. I think in reflection, the thing that really stood out for me was his comment around this commercial industrial sector being a bit of a sweet spot. And like me, as a bit of an energy nerd, I guess, when I fly from one place to another, I'm always looking out the window at the rooftops, and always staggered by the number of empty ones. And I think, the more we see that underutilized real estate, if you will, like when we think about, and I've been seeing a lot of commentary lately about, not wanting to use farmland for solar and things like that, which I completely agree with. Like we need food, we need that. But there's a lot of unused real estate that is sitting on the tops of these buildings, where awesome things are happening inside the buildings, and often energy intensive things are happening inside the buildings, that I think we're going to see more business leaders waking up to the opportunity, especially as to Greg's point, the utility rates rising 40% over the last 5 years. What if it continues on that? What if it's higher than that? What if even if it's lower than that, it's still going to go up, and it's just going to make the opportunity to be that prosumer that much more attractive. So I think I'm excited, day in and day out by the focusing on this space and helping business leaders, deploy these systems and make that change. What stood out most for you?
Well, I think the prosumer end state is the reality, isn't it? And I think in order for people to capitalize on that, they need to have the assets to be able to play the game and play the system. And so I think we're in that phase of let's get the assets on the ground, let's get them installed, and then let's continue to unlock more and more monetization potential. And I think to your point, I think the real estate asset owners are really starting to realize that this is not only a cost play, but it's a revenue play. And especially when you start thinking about how you unlock energy for behind the meter inference and things like that, I think it's a very exciting space. I think he closed out so well with his comment about, as a CFO, just look at your energy bills and look at them 5 years ago and predict where they're going to be 5 years from now. And I think we're massive advocates of that, aren't we? As this energy rates are projected based on our analysis to be going up 4 to 6% minimum in almost every state across the country. And while we're seeing sort of 30 to 40% of behind the meter systems penciling based on utility rates today, by 2030, it's most of them, and by 2033, it's every property in every state is beating utility rates. And I think that'll happen quicker, honestly, in terms of cost reductions of systems, especially the compressed soft costs, and the rate at which the utility rates will go up as there's more strain in the system. So I think very exciting times, right spot, right time, and it's cool to actually hear it from someone who's not sort of directly in the industry, but is studying it very intently.
Absolutely. Yeah, great stuff, and look forward to hearing some feedback on this episode, Kira.
Yeah, good one. Cheers, Dan.
Cheers.
We receive a lot of questions from business leaders around the world wanting to learn more about the energy transition, what is possible, and where to start. So to help you stay informed and up to date on best practices, opportunities, risks, and success stories, we created an industry newsfeed at VECKTA.com/news with all our podcasts, blogs, and newsletter. Check it out and connect with Dan, myself, and the VECKTA team to learn more. Cheers and have a good one.